February 1942. The waters off the coast of the United States had gone silent. According to records held by the U.S. National Archives and the Naval History and Heritage Command, German U-boats were operating just miles from American cities, sinking ships within sight of shore. Civilians stood on beaches in Florida and North Carolina and watched oil tankers burn at night. At this moment, the United States Navy was losing the Battle of the Atlantic faster than it could replace ships. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, the official naval historian of World War II, later wrote that early 1942 was the darkest moment for American shipping. German submarines were destroying merchant vessels at a rate that threatened the entire Allied war effort. What made this worse was that American coastal defenses were completely unprepared. There were too few patrol aircraft, not enough escort ships, and almost no effective anti-submarine coordination. The Germans called it the second happy time. For American sailors, it was a slaughter. But in this chaos, an unlikely solution began to emerge, one that did not come from admirals, war colleges, or shipyards. It came from fishermen. According to U.S. Coast Guard records and wartime correspondence preserved at the Smithsonian Institution, the Navy initially dismissed civilian involvement in anti-submarine warfare as impractical. Fishermen lacked military training, their boats were small, their equipment was outdated. But these civilians had something the Navy did not: intimate knowledge of coastal waters. Men who had fished these seas for decades knew currents, tides, shallow channels, and hidden shoals better than any naval chart. They could tell when something was wrong simply by how the water moved. By March 1942, desperation forced change. The U.S. Coast Guard quietly authorized the creation of the Temporary Reserve, later formalized as the Coast Guard Auxiliary. According to Coast Guard historian Robert Browning, thousands of civilian mariners volunteered within weeks. They brought their own boats, their own fuel, in many cases their own weapons, old rifles and shotguns, until the military could supply depth charges. The Navy still didn't trust them, but it had no choice. Using logs preserved at the Naval War College and after-action reports now declassified, historians have reconstructed how these civilian crews operated. They patrolled at night, engines off, listening. German U-boats ran on diesel engines when surfaced and electric motors when submerged. Fishermen could hear the difference. According to oral histories recorded by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, some crews identified submarines by sound alone. When they suspected a contact, they radioed the Navy or dropped makeshift markers, sometimes weighted bottles or floats, to track movement until military aircraft arrived. These were not dramatic battles, there were no headlines, but they worked. By late summer 1942, U-boat sinkings along the American coast declined sharply. Historian Clay Blair in Hitler's U-boat war credits coastal patrol coordination, including civilian auxiliaries, as a key factor. The happy time was ending. According to the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, the most important change wasn't new ships or weapons. It was information flow. Civilians reported faster than military patrols. They recognized patterns. They noticed when shipping lanes changed or when debris appeared where it shouldn't. One Coast Guard report from October 1942, now archived by the U.S. National Archives, notes that over 70% of early submarine sightings came from non-military observers. The Navy never publicly admitted how dependent it had become on these volunteers. Official press releases credited destroyers and aircraft. But inside the system, commanders knew the truth. The Atlantic supply line stabilized not because of overwhelming force, but because ordinary people refused to stay on shore. When the war ended, the fishermen went home. According to Coast Guard demobilization records, most received no medals, no pensions, and no formal recognition beyond a certificate. Their boats returned to fishing. Their names disappeared from official histories. Naval historian Samuel Morrison later acknowledged in private correspondence that, without the civilian coastal patrols, the Atlantic War would have been prolonged at unacceptable cost. But history rarely celebrates the unseen. There were no victory parades for the men who listened in the dark. This story is drawn from primary sources held by the U.S. National Archives, the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Library of Congress. It matters because it challenges how wars are remembered. World War II was not won only by generals and factories. It was won by people who noticed small things, a sound in the water, a shadow where none should be. YouTube is full of battles and heroes. But history is also built by civilians who acted when institutions failed. And sometimes the most important weapons are not guns or ships, but attention, courage, and the willingness to step forward when no one asks you to.